Okay, now we're back. Okay, fasten your seatbelts. Here we go. We're going to do a lot of work today. And we're going to have to do a quick overview of the Sermon on the Mount, and that is chapter 5, verse 13, all the way through chapter 7, verse 29. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in 5 and 6, but what I will do is show you the bookends from 5 and 7 and talk a more about, let's say, chapter 7. Then look at the transition into 8. Look at 8 and 9, which is real important, but we can do that quickly. I just want to highlight things so you get the flow of what Matthew's doing and how it ties into, I believe, the Exodus. And then we'll get into 10, which introduces us nicely into chapter 11. And chapter 11, I want you to know, is not an easy text to deal with, but I think it's a necessary text. So here we go. We have bookends. What is a bookend? Well, Scripture writes, authors of Scripture often write in bookends. They'll give you a statement in, let's say for us will be chapter 5, verse 17, and then another bookend that concludes that section in, for example, Matthew 7, verse 12. So those are our bookends for the Sermon on the Mount. We're going to do chapter 5, verse 17. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. So then, Matthew has lots of material in between there, and then he concludes his section with another bookend, and that is chapter 7, verse 12. So whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. So between those two bookends, we have a lot of material that we don't have time to go through. But we're talking about Jesus proclaiming himself as Torah, and this, meaning all that material between the bookends, is the way I want the people of God to follow me. So this is significant stuff. The Sermon on the Mount is really heavy-duty stuff. It's the kind of stuff that takes a lifetime to digest. But if we do digest it and begin to understand the high ethical call upon each and every one of us as a Christian, we begin to say, oh my gosh, there's something to being a Christian that I didn't buy into necessarily or understand upon my baptism. So let's get started. How might we understand the material between the two bookends, 5:17 and 7:12? And I would say if we were to focus on what it means to fulfill the law and the prophets, that will help us understand that material in between. Now, the law is all about character. It's character building. That's what the law is trying to do. It's trying to help the people of God become people of character. Whose character? God's character. There's a lot about Sabbath observance in this, and there's also a lot about dietary restrictions. But do they ensure that you are more like God? Not necessarily. Not necessarily. Nevertheless, God has the boundaries to help keep you, to help keep us anchored. So according to Paul, the fundamental covenant that was made by God was with Abraham, and that was a covenant based on trust. So we've got the law, okay? We've got the Torah, and the Torah is really important. I'm not saying it's not. Jesus is not saying it's not. Jesus is just refocusing Torah in himself. But the Torah is trying to build character. It's trying to help with Sabbath observance, and it's trying to help them understand dietary restrictions, which were necessary in the Old Testament because it helped define what the people of God did, and what they ate define who they are also. But Paul turns around and says, you know what? The most important covenant is the covenant with Abraham. That's the most important one. That's the first covenant that Yahweh made. And it's a covenant of trust. And once you make a deal, you can't go back and change it. That's the interesting thing about a covenant. When you make the deal, you can't go back and change it. In fact, what happens in ancient covenants is that every year, if Israel were to make a covenant with Syria, then every year they would bring out the covenant and they would say in front of a representative of Israel, this is our covenant, we're going to read it through, this is what we've agreed to, and we're not supposed to break it. So the covenants are real important stuff in both the Old and the New Testament. And so God makes a covenant of trust with Abram. And so Paul is saying that saying that the Torah was not the foundational covenant. Thus, this is Rick Watts from Regent College saying this, and it's really fascinating. I resisted it when I first heard it, but I think there may be something to it. Therefore, the Torah has a temporary role. It has a temporary role, so that there can be tweaking and changes made to the Torah. So Jesus can come in and say, no, I'm making some changes here because I am the Torah. So it's very interesting. Now this shook me when I first read this and I heard this, and I wasn't sure how to take it. I'm still not entirely sure how to take it. But if Rick Watts is correct that it's movable, if you will, it can be changed. It changes everything entirely. So the Christians can come in and pick and choose what feeds us and doesn't feed us. And Jesus comes in and basically does that for us. He says, no, this is important and that's important, but I'm not focusing in on the dietary laws. I'm focusing more in on our attitude in worship, and I'm focusing more in on how our hearts are transformed and how we reach out in holiness and justice. And so those kinds of, if we accept this thesis, what we've got then is a Jesus who comes in and says, Torah is important, it's character building, it's real important for worship, and dietary laws are important, but now you're focusing on me, and let's talk about the heart, and let's talk about justice, let's talk about holiness, let's talk about those kinds of things instead of the dietary laws. So it's really, really an interesting way to approach the Torah. So therefore, the basic relationship with God is the foundational covenant. The foundational covenant of trust with Abraham. So promises come through the Spirit. You live according to the Spirit. Jesus was baptized in the Spirit. And now you're going to look like daughters and sons of God, because you will start looking like the new Torah people. Even though it appears the law is flying apart, as Jesus is sort of dismantling it in some ways, and everyone's going, oh my gosh, what is he doing? Look what he's saying. Look how he's pointing to himself instead of the Torah. It looks like everything is being dismantled. But in fact, what Jesus is saying is, now you need to learn how to keep your eyes on me. When we talk about Jesus as our Lord and Savior, we're talking about something really important here, because we're told to keep our eyes upon him. And he's making that point in the Sermon on the Mount. This is how you live your life. This is the new Torah, and you are the new people of God, and this is what it means to follow me. So when we start considering Christ the Messiah, we need to start considering what's key, what's important. So Jesus is not only the law's ultimate interpreter, and I'll reference that as Matthew 7:28 and following, but he transcends it. He goes beyond the Torah. In other words, he neither dissolves the law, nor prolongs the law, nor increases the law, because that puts an emphasis on the wrong place. It puts an emphasis on the law. And what Jesus is doing, and we see that pretty clearly through Paul also, is that he is now putting his emphasis on himself. For example, Paul wrote Christ is the goal of the law, and that is in Romans chapter 3, verse 21, and also, I'll just read 21 and 22, but you can also find it in Romans 8:4. So let me read Romans 3, 21 and 22. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe, for there is no distinction. So as Christians, we're always must start with Jesus. Jesus is the starting point for us. We begin to see, we see Jesus, and who do we see? We see God. We see God the Father. So Jesus then is the starting point for us. And so we don't start with Old Testament Torah, though we respect it and we look at it and we try to understand it, because what emerges out of that is a Messiah who says, now look at me, I am the new Torah. But what happens is that there is now a new focus, and the focus is Jesus. The focus is Jesus as the Logos, as John, the gospel writer John, calls him, the divine word. So, that's all that material in between, okay? I know you're confused, but we're moving fast. So now let's go to chapter 7, verses 13 through 27. This is the final call for decision and commitment. Final call for decision and commitment. Matthew 7, 13 and 14. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide, and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow, and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. This is typical rabbinic language. It's a common image in Judaism. So you have two alternatives, don't you? You've got the wide way, which means a lot of people can go down that path or through that gate. And then you have the narrow, which only a few people go through. And sometimes the narrow actually refers to persecution. So we have a way and we have a gate in what Jesus is saying in 7, 13, and 14. This is imagery. This is imagery of a path to life in the kingdom. And there's a command here. Enter to the narrow way of persecution, and it's now. See how in 7 he starts ratcheting things up. Jesus is now saying to those who are listening to him, and you know the background that I've given you, that may not have been a lot of people there. It may have been Jesus' teaching over his 3 years that is now compiled into a teaching moment in the Gospels. Nevertheless, people are hearing this, and Jesus is pushing for decision. This is who I am. I am the new Torah. I build character. I build character through heart. And when you have a transformed heart, you have a new understanding of holiness that impacts one's desire and heart for justice. And so Jesus is saying all these things, and then he comes along and he says, but there's a narrow gate, and only a few people can get through this. So now he's turning the heat up on people. Then in verses 15 and 20, if you've got it in front of you, read along with me. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. So now Jesus goes to another metaphor, the metaphor of trees, which is also found in rabbinic writing. So the trees, good prophets, bad prophets, okay? And how do you how do you reconcile the difference between a good prophet and a bad prophet? Well, in verses 16 through 20, you look for their fruit, don't you? You look for the evidence in their lives as to whether or not they are a good prophet or a diseased prophet. Their end, and think, let me refer you back to now Matthew chapter 3, verse 10. Their end, if they're diseased trees, is this: then even now the axe is laid to the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So you see this metaphor coming back again. If you're a diseased tree, the only thing to do is to cut you down and burn you. And so Jesus is saying, you got to watch the fruit of those around you, those who are proclaiming me, those who are proclaiming to know who God is. And if their fruit, the fruit of their lives, matches what they're saying, then you have a healthy tree. And that healthy tree is someone you should follow. So see how Jesus is turning up the heat on everyone who's listening to him. Now look at chapter 7, verses 21, 22, and 23. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. We have two confessions here. Lord, Lord, which is a respectful address, addressing the Christ. So you have those who are saying, Lord, Lord, and then you have obedience, not confession, is the act that Jesus is looking for. Lord, Lord. And he says, I'm not looking for that kind of a confession. I'm looking for obedience. Who's got a heart to follow through with this? Who's got the heart to be the people of God as I'm laying out for you in this Sermon on the Mount? The will of my Father in heaven. This is an ultimate expression of the Father's will. And so he's referencing that. You know, who's going to follow my Father's will? Are you going to do that? Well, if you're going to do it, don't just confess it. You've got to be obedient in doing that. Whew, he's turning the heat up on everybody. And I suspect he's turning the heat up on you too. Also, the righteous suffer. Why did he put it here? Well, because he's just come off the narrow way, the narrow gate. And remember, that narrow gate can mean persecution. And so he puts in here, yeah, there's persecution that can come out of this. Verses 24 through 27. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house. But it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. So when Mary Jo and I got married, we got married in England. And we chose this text as our wedding text. And the English were scratching their heads. They couldn't figure out why these Americans would pick such a difficult text for their marriage. And what we're simply trying to say is that we understand that this marriage has got to be built on something more than sand. It's got to be built on a foundation, and the foundation has got to be built with Jesus as our foundation. And you know, after 40 years, the winds have blown and the rain has come, and yikes. But we would say to those wonderful people at our wedding, as we would say today, you got to have a foundation to get through that kind of stuff. And so that's what Jesus is saying. Where is your foundation? In one sense, I think he's saying if your foundation is Torah, as good and as wonderful as that is, and Paul will tell that to us in Romans, as wonderful as that is, there's a new foundation, and the foundation is me, and I am the new Torah. And you need to follow my words. Not just confess them, but to follow my words. So these two builders, there's an authoritative expression in how these builders build. I mean, the wise man in Judaism, the wise man is the one who walked in the way of Torah. And the storm and the trials that come, that's what the wind and the rain represent, those stormy trials that come to each and every one of us. Ultimately, we weather that if we have the correct foundation. And I believe Jesus is saying, it's not the Torah, it's me. Now here we go with the transition. Thank goodness, huh? Verses 28 and 29. And when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. This is almost identical to what Mark has in Mark chapter 1, verse 22. And they were astonished at his teachings, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as the scribes. I mean, this is clearly a phrase that is that's common. And so it probably was said by the people throughout Jesus' 3 years as he's itinerant preacher going around teaching and performing all kinds of miracles, of demonstrating God's character and God's power in his life. And so they probably said this multiple times as he was teaching. But what does it mean? Well, when Jesus has finished saying these things, he closes all of the narrative and all of the teaching that we've been through from chapter 1 through chapter 7. He's closing it, all of that. And how does he say it? There's an authority in the teaching that has you've just heard, the teaching you've witnessed, the miracles that are before you. So he's closing all of that out. And the point is that there is amazement at Jesus' authority. The emphasis on Jesus' authority. That's what I want you to see. The authoritative teaching that he has. Jesus speaks as though he alone knows fully the will of God. There's no ifs, ands, or buts here. No woulda, shoulda, couldas. He's out there going, this is the way it is. You follow this way. This is how you deal with that. This is how we'll deal with that other thing. I mean, he's just clear. And it's that clearness and that decisiveness that just draws people into him. Now, we can also see that in human leaders today and in the past who have been charismatic in how they've presented ideas or thoughts. And what do? You follow the fruit. You follow the fruit. If the fruit's not there, then you're probably dealing with a diseased tree. All right, so now we've concluded with all of that material, chapters 1 through 7. Now we're going to start into a whole new section, and this is chapters 8. I'm going to take you 8 through 9 first, then we'll look at 10, and if time permits, we'll get into 11. Now, this is going to be fast. Chapters 8 and 9, really, really important. Why? Because remember the theme, the background theme that I hope you're picking up on is that Matthew is communicating to us a new exodus. A new exodus. And now we have in chapters 8 and 9, 10 mighty acts, or 10 mighty deeds. Now, where have you heard 10 before? 10 commandments? What other 10? Maybe go back to Genesis. Go back to Genesis.
Takes 10 people to have.
Oh, I hadn't thought about that, Ann.
You have to have 10 people to have a church.
You're way ahead of me.
Yeah. It's a synagogue.
Okay. What? This may throw you a little bit. What about 10 plagues? Ah. Remember? 10 plagues. He's the new Moses. Remember? The new Moses. We got an encounter going on here with, in one sense, Herod the Pharaoh. But instead of being plagues, what are they? 10 mighty deeds. They're 10 blessings is what happens. And so Jesus comes on the scene and says, hey, wait till you see what God's going to do in the lives of people around. So we're going to blow right through this, but I want you to see the 10. Cleansing of the lepers, verses 1 through 4. Okay? That's a mighty deed, isn't it? Faith of the centurion. Why is that significant? Because he's a centurion. Because he's a Gentile. And what does Jesus say? I have never seen so much faith out of one individual. Even all of Israel doesn't have the faith of this one centurion. That's a remarkable thing. That's a great, mighty deed. And he heals many. We have a series of healings that go through there. And some of those healings take place in Capernaum. And the cost of following Jesus. There's a cost to this. Jesus calms the sea. That's a Moses thing to do, don't you think? Absolutely. Jesus calms the sea. Heals 2 men with demons. Well, of course he's going to heal 2 with demons. We already read that in chapter 4. Remember, Jesus has the encounter face-to-face with Satan. The only time there's a face-to-face between Satan and Jesus. And who won? Jesus. And what did Jesus say? Begone, Satan. And what happened? He was gone. So that sets the precedent. It foreshadows what's going to come each and every time Jesus comes up with a demon. We already know what's going to happen. They cannot stand before him. Now this is interesting. We have the healing of the paralytic. I'm not sure what to do with the calling of Matthew or the questions about fasting. Somehow they fit in there. I'm not entirely sure. Maybe Matthew is saying, you know what? I'm a mighty deed. I was a tax collector. I was hated by all. I was taking money from my brothers and sisters. And yet Jesus came along and saw in my heart transformation. Someone who could be transformed into a follower. Maybe that's what he's saying. It's not necessary to come up with 10. In fact, it screws everything up. If I count these 2, we've got 12. But I've been told that they're 10. The girl restored to life, and the woman who's healed, and then 2 more. Jesus heals 2 blind men. And Jesus heals a man who is unable to speak. Okay? 10 blessings, 10 mighty deeds that counter the 10 plagues that we see in Exodus. Exodus. Look at that. You're already to chapter 10. You're just blowing ahead here. Now we have 12 disciples and the call upon their lives. Now we got a focusing in of the formal calling. We have Matthew. Isn't that interesting? Matthew got his own spot in chapter 9. But now we've got the calling of the others. And so calling of the 12, verses 1 through 4. Jesus sends out the 12. Just because Jesus calls you doesn't mean you get to just hang around the camp all the time. Jesus has purpose. In calling, you are sent out. Why? Because now you're gaining the character of God. You're gaining holiness, and that holiness is transformed into justice, and proclamation. The kerygma, the proclamation of the good news is taking place already. And healing, the power of healing is taking place. And then the reminder again, persecution will come. You see, that inserts itself multiple times along Jesus' teaching, all the way up to chapter 10. Persecution will come. Persecution will come. And have no fear. I don't bring peace, I bring the sword. But there are rewards with Jesus. And here's the conclusion. This is a serious picture of what it means to follow Jesus. Now notice something else that we've been talking about. At the end of chapter 7, which is the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is pushing. This is what it means to follow me. And now here we are again, the calling of the disciples, the sending them out. Persecution will come. Have no fear. Peace, but sword, not peace, but a sword. And rewards will be there, but this is what it means to follow me. So Jesus is pushing for decision. And I think this is Matthew's underlying theme in this gospel, is he's pushing for decision. You have to come to terms with Jesus. Now, remember way back in session 1, we talked about the audience. And the audience could easily have been scholars, both Greek and Jewish scholars, and they're digesting all of this. And there's also a Jewish component to those who are listening to this, and as they listen to the teachings of Jesus through the Gospel of Mark, they too are being challenged to own up, to step up, and come to terms with who this guy Jesus is. So in one sense, this gospel is a gospel of decision, I believe. It's a real important gospel for decision. Okay, you ready? Here we go. Chapter 11. Now we're going to call this the rising opposition. And we see the rising opposition in chapter 11, starting with verse 2, all the way through 12 verse 50. Rising opposition. Are you surprised by that? Heavens no. He's already told you you're going to be persecuted. Multiple times he's told us persecution's coming. And so now we get to this place where there's pushback. Jesus and his disciples are getting pushback. Of course, well, he's already called them and sent them out, and they've already been doing all this stuff. So and Jesus is itinerant. He's been out there speaking and preaching and teaching and doing all kinds of miracles, and now the pushback starts to come. But how does it come? Well, the structure is this. There's a question that John the Baptist asks. Now let's pause for a moment and think back. Where was the last time we saw John the Baptist? At the baptism, exactly. What happened then in chapter 4? Those of you who read ahead from that, he was arrested by whom? Herod, right? He was arrested. So now he's at Herod's palace. I've never been to Herod's palace, but I can see it every time we go to the Dead Sea. I can see it across the Dead Sea on the Jordanian side. One of these days I'll get there. But there's Herod's palace, and in the bottom of the palace would be the prison. And so that's where John the Baptist is right now. And so it's this whole pushback starts with John the Baptist. And then there's warning and invitation. There's Sabbath signs. in chapter 12, verses 1 through 14. Jesus' identity. Jesus suggests that he is the servant who brings rest to everyone, and that's in 12:15 through 21. And then they think he is in league with Beelzebul, and that is in chapter 12, verses 22 through 32. And then Jesus replies to all of this in chapter 12, 33 through 37. Okay, that's the big picture. Then there's demand for signs, 38 through 42, chapter 12. Jesus warns them about the consequences, chapter 12, 43 through 45. And Jesus' definition of who his true family is comes in chapter 12, verses 46 to 50. So, all of that's the structure, okay? So that's the big picture structure that we're going to go through. Now, let's back up and let's start with John the Baptist and his big question. So this section begins with John the Baptist, and he had a major role in chapter 3, shows up in chapter 4. Now he has a major role in chapter 11. And this section is intriguing because what do you do when John begins to have doubts about what is going on surrounding Jesus? I don't know about you, but there was a time in my life that rocked me when I was reading this going, John, of all people, how could you have doubts at this point? So verse 2, chapter 11, verse 2. Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? And Jesus answered them, Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is the one who is not offended by me. So John has doubt, okay? I'm going to put it on the table. John has doubt. John focuses on the works of the Christ, and this is not how John normally has spoken about Jesus. Matthew is using the word the Christ because the Christ is the Son of David. And one of the big themes that runs through Matthew is the Son of David. So to speak of the work of the Christ is to say this Son of David does not look like the traditional Son of David that everyone expected. This Son of David is not a political rebel rouser. This guy would not lead the zealots into a massive battle with Rome. This is a different Son of David than everybody expected. So instead of defeating Israel's enemy, what's he doing? He's preaching, teaching, and healing. And you're saying, well, he's the Messiah. Of course he's healing. But back up a moment. There's very little evidence in the Old Testament, especially from the prophets, that the Messiah was expected to be a healer. Think about it. You and I take that for granted. Of course, he's the Messiah. But think about those who were witnessing this and they're claiming that he is the Christ, the Son of David. And they're going, yeah, but David he wasn't a healer. David was a fighter. David was a political figure. David was anything but this guy that we've got on the scene. And so Jesus then is telling them, you know what? You may not have expected what you got, but what you've got is the real thing. You've got the new Moses, and now you've got the new Torah, and you've got the new Exodus, and now it's time to be obedient to it and live it out with me. And John's going, oh my gosh, I didn't expect this. Is this really true? Is this really the Messiah that we've been anticipating? So then look at verse 3. And he said to him, Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another? It's the big doubt right there. Shall we look for another? And John is referring to Isaiah 43, which is anticipating Yahweh's own presence. Remember, I told you, you may not remember this, but let me remind you what I said several sessions ago, when we were talking about John the Baptist, and we were talking about Jesus' baptism. What I'm submitting to you is that when Jesus got into the baptismal pool with John, John looked at him and said, I didn't expect this. You are showing up? I'm here announcing that Yahweh is coming. Not the Messiah per se. Yahweh himself is coming. And who steps in? Jesus, my cousin. And look, a dove appears. And I think I hear the voice of God. And he's going, oh my gosh, what's going on here? But John the Baptist was to announce and proclaim the coming of Yahweh. Now you and I, standing back in the 21st century, going, well, of course, he is Yahweh. But think about how Matthew is understanding this as he's looking at his own scriptures, and he's saying, but was the Messiah supposed to be baptized? Was the Messiah supposed to come and do all these healings? And then on the very words of lips of John the Baptist, he said, are we to look for another? So John was preaching that anyone who did not, that if a disease, John was preaching that if a diseased tree came along, what do? You cut it down at its roots, don't you? You cut it down at the trunk. And so now John is saying, you know, I was preaching a big judgment theme, and now I need to look at the fruit that's coming from this. Or Jesus is actually saying to John, you need to look at the fruit. That's what he's saying. Jesus is saying, John, look at the fruit and see if there isn't a consistency here. And this is the Son of David shows up so many times in the book of Isaiah. And we wonder if even Isaiah understood who was supposed to come. We say, well, he's the prophet. Of course he knew that the Messiah was the suffering servant, for example. And I'm starting to think, no, not necessarily. Just because you're the prophet and just because you're proclaiming things doesn't necessarily mean you understand all the components of what's coming out of your mouth. And so Isaiah proclaiming a suffering servant who's to come, well, there's all kinds of options. It could be Israel as the suffering servant. It could be Isaiah as the suffering servant, or another prophet, or maybe there is a king that's supposed to come and be this suffering servant, or maybe there is supposed to be a Messiah. So we've got at least 5 options here as to who the suffering servant is. And Jesus now comes in and is saying, you may not have expected what you got, but you need to look at the fruit. And here's the fruit. The blind see. The lame walk. Those who cannot speak now speak. And the poor's heart are jumping with joy. And so you begin to see another picture of the Messiah emerging that was not anticipated. So, what does that mean? It means John the Baptist, I think he has every right to say, hey, are you really the one? Because I've been combing over Isaiah and I don't see you. So, verse 5, the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And nobody's expecting this kind of stuff. There are blindness metaphors in Isaiah 6 and Isaiah 29, but it's for understanding the Torah. So there is blindness metaphors in Isaiah. So Jesus is saying to John, I know what you're thinking, and calm down, relax, cuz it's going to be okay. In verse 6, and blessed is the one who is not offended by me. Ooh, that's a powerful statement. There is really something about Jesus that discombobulates people. What a great word. Discombobulates people. Why? Because in the end, you have to put your faith in Jesus. And Jesus messes with your whole worldview. And no one's quite sure what's going on. Torah, is it at the center? of Israel and not necessarily faith in a Messiah to come? Well, I think maybe that's being said underneath. And consider Paul. He sees a resurrected Jesus on the way to Damascus. He sees a resurrected Jesus, and he's going, oh no, this just blows my worldview completely out of the water. What am I going to do? And so now he's in confusion in Acts chapter 9 during what we call the conversion of Paul. Now his worldview is turned upside down because no one expected a resurrected Messiah to come. So Jesus asked the question in verse 7. As they went away, Jesus began to speak to the crowds concerning John. What did you go out into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind? What does reed mean here? I think it means everybody. I mean, it's a reference to absolutely everybody. And then he goes on to say, become very specific. What then did you go out to see? A man dressed in soft clothing? Behold, those who wear soft clothing are in kings' houses. Kings or attendants of kings. Verse 9, what then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. And this is the only category that they have for John. But he's more than that. Is he a prophet? Yes, he's a prophet, but he is more than that. Verse 10, this is he of whom it is written, behold, I send my messenger before your face, who will prepare your way before you. Well, that's Malachi chapter 3, verses 1 and chapter 4, verse 5. Let me read to you Malachi 3:1. Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. And in Malachi 4:5, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes. So the one whose way is being prepared in Malachi is not the Messiah, but instead it's Yahweh. See, the prophets were clear that it was Yahweh who was supposed to come. And Elijah is the one who is expected to announce Yahweh's coming. So look at verse 11. Truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. This is out of Jesus' mouth. Yet the one who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. So why is John so great in Jesus' eyes? Because he stands at the threshold of the old and the new. He stands, he's not a New Testament prophet. He is Old Testament as they come. He's not a New Testament prophet in any way, shape, form, or fashion. He now represents the very end of the prophetic tradition of the Old Testament. But he stands at the threshold, and he's been given a message of judgment in terms of preparing people's heart for what is about to come on the other side of the threshold. And what's about to come on the other side of the threshold is, of course, Yahweh, who Malachi is announcing and Elijah is supposed to announce. So, what's going on? Jesus now, looking back at John, recognizes that John is there at the threshold, and his whole purpose is to announce something new that's about to happen. And he does. And he is great, because he stands in that role and he's looking into a new way that he doesn't understand. We've already seen that in the beginning of chapter 11. He doesn't quite understand it, but he's been used by God to announce something new. And Jesus now, on the other side of that threshold, looks back at John and says, good job, good job. Now trust me in this. Verse 12. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. Now, that's not to say that this is not promoting violence. It's not what it's doing here. But the basic option for the kingdom of God is forcefully and mightily advancing. That's what it's about. The kingdom of God is forcefully and mightily advancing. It's moving. God's behind it and moving. And you know when God does things, there's a movement. We see that in revivals all the time. When the Spirit of God gets behind a movement, it just starts to move on its own, as if people just start to get on board. And I think that's what Jesus is saying here, is that the kingdom of God is moving forward, and it's moving forward mightily. And we're going to see that in the book of Acts. It really does move forward mightily. But that doesn't mean that there isn't resistance. Instead, there is plenty of people fighting against the movement that's moving forward. And you know that, I know that. We know that in religious movements, and we know that in political movements. So it doesn't mean that the kingdom is coming with violence or forcefully advancing like a jihad. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the Spirit of God moving forward mightily. So Jesus is responding to John so what has Jesus been saying to John? He's saying, go back, rethink the Messianic texts, go and look at mighty deeds, realize that there are those who oppose us, and thus John's imprisonment and death in chapter 14, eventually Jesus' own death, represent that opposition that's coming and will be full-blown by the time we get to 14 and beyond. Verse 13, for all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. Now, look at the order here. It's been reversed, hasn't it? We always talk about the law and the prophets. And now it's been reversed to prophets and law. And this is a matter of emphasis. It's predictive, that the prophets predict what is going to happen in the future. And here Jesus is saying the prophets predict the eschaton, the end times. But the law implies the end times. It implies the end times without restoration to it, I think, is what I'm trying to say here. The prophets are talking about an end time, but there's a sense of restoration that comes with the prophets' words. But the law also believes that there's an end time, but it doesn't have that sense of restoration. Maybe that's the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, is that the Pharisees embraced an idea of resurrection, whereas the Sadducees only embraced the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. And they had no concept whatsoever of resurrection. And so Jesus then is obviously a resurrection. He would probably have been a good Pharisee if we had to put that title on him. But there's a big difference coming in how they understand restoration, and the prophets understood a restoration was coming, an end time that will bring the rest of God, the peace of God. Okay. Now let me just get to Elijah, and then we'll call it quits. Okay, verse 14. And if you are willing to accept it, he, referring to John the Baptist, is Elijah who is to come. If you can accept it. Isn't that interesting? It's a conditional clause there. If you can accept it, it means he knows not everybody's going to accept this. Not everybody's going to believe that Malachi 5:4 is being fulfilled in Jesus or in John the Baptist, for that matter. But for Jesus, it's clear that John the Baptist is Elijah who was prophesied to come. Now the difference is that Jesus is saying that John the Baptist is Elijah. Elijah, according to Malachi, is to command or to announce the coming of Yahweh. You see, that's the problem. Problem is Jesus Yahweh or not? And everything that Jesus has said up to this point is pointing to himself in a capacity that says, I'm the new Moses, I'm the new Torah, I'm the new Exodus, and you're the new people of God. That says that Yahweh is here. So John the Baptist now is put in that position of Elijah, and he is, whether he understands it or not, announcing the coming of Yahweh in the Messiah, Jesus. Okay, let's stop there, and I'm going to ask you for your questions or comments.